of you here in the room know about Eric Gardner, who was killed in New York in a chokehold? Okay. So he is mostly known because of the fact that when the police tackled him and brought him down, he kept saying, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe," and it became a rallying cry. He's also been talked about in terms of indicting broken windows theory of policing, because all they suspected of him was having some loose cigarettes that he had sold potentially 6 months before. But Eric Gardner's death is also a tale of what's wrong with stop and frisk. After he was killed, the New York City police put out a claim that he was resisting arrest. And that didn't make any sense to me. So I called up the attorney who ended up getting the huge settlement in the case, and I said, how could he be resisting arrest? And he was, oh, that's you, okay. I thought that was my thing going crazy. I said, how could that be true? And he said, it wasn't. It was, they had no warrant to arrest him. They had no probable cause to arrest him. In fact, they didn't even have reasonable suspicion that would give rise to something that they were allowed to stop him under. So what was it? It was a bad Terry stop. They suspected that he sold untaxed cigarettes, but that's all they had is mere suspicion, which means that on paper, as the attorney said, he was walking away just as he was supposed to do. If he had absolute right to walk away from the police. And if he had stopped and talked to the police and let them search him, that would have been considered consensual. Instead, Eric Gardner told the police, every time you see me, you want to mess with me. I'm tired of it. It stops today. The New York Police Department called this resisting arrest. I call it refusing to consent. The chokehold was his punishment for not consenting. Eric Gardner's death illustrates what can happen to a man who tries to hold on to his dignity and rights in the stop and frisk regime. What a lot of people don't know about Eric Gardner is that 7 years before he was killed, he filed a civil rights claim against the city. It was against officers for performing a strip search on him in public during a pedestrian stop. Under oath, Gardner wrote that the officer performed a cavity search by unzipping his shorts and inspecting his genitals while people passed him on the street. The officer, quote, dug his fingers into my rectum in the middle of the street. In the space for injuries, Gardner wrote, the injuries I received was to my manhood. When you know that, and then you hear what Eric Gardner said to the police on that fatal day, it makes even more sense. He says, I'm minding my business, officer. I'm minding my business. Please just leave me alone. I told you the last time. Please just leave me alone. Please, please don't touch me. Do not touch me. When Eric Gardner tells the police to leave him alone, the officers have to take him down to prove they are in control. And generally, we want police to be in control of any encounter. We train them to do that. The sexualized frisk or strip search must be understood as a logical extension of the control theory of stop and frisk. As feminism teaches, sexual harassment and sexual abuse is often a way to show dominance. The unwanted touch proves who controls the film studios and who controls the streets. Now, sexual misconduct by police is a lot more common than people realize. The Cato Institute, which is no left-leaning institution, found sexual abuse as to be the second most common civilian complaint lodged against police in the United States. Even the International Association of Police Chiefs recognize it. And as they explain, the blue code of silence helps take what could be individual bad officers and what individual officers do and turn it into a systemic problem. So we know that the frisk creates the opportunity for abuse. We saw that with what happened in Eric Gardner. But in addition, so that was a good example of abuse, illegal. But in addition, a lot of times when the officers are doing exactly what they're trained to do in the frisk, it feels like abuse to the person who is being frisked. And there is a police officer that then went on to go to law school and became a professor of law, and he wrote an article and talks about what it was like when he was a police officer. And this is a quote from him. "I would reach around over the front of the thighs and doing the same thing from the back, running my hand along clothing between suspects' legs, starting on one side and making my way across. Inevitably, this involved contact through gloves and clothing with suspects' buttocks and genitalia, but that contact was essential for an effective frisk." He explains, "The groin and buttocks bear special mention as it has been drilled into me in training that criminals knew and took advantage of the fact that officers were naturally uncomfortable searching these areas." So when I get complaints from people about how it felt like a rape when they were frisked, I don't know whether what the officer was doing was completely by the book and in fact what he was trained to do, or whether they went too far. It's a very, very thin line. When law professors, like myself, we teach the Terry Doctrine, we say the Constitution places limits on the police discretion. For example, they must have reasonable suspicion to do the stop. But that's not quite true, because the constitutional limits on Terry have to be asserted. Terry allows the police to ask consent for everything. And I use consent broadly here. Not only consent to search, but consent to frisk, consent to stop and answer questions. In fact, the theory really about how Terry versus Ohio goes and fights crime is it starts off with an officer's suspicion, and then the person waives their rights, and that's how we get to finding drugs or finding out about criminality. Here's what's wrong with consent. When I train middle school students about their rights, I teach them to say, "Officer, I do not consent to searches," but they worry the officer will retaliate. They all know that this happened to Eric Gardner and to friends of theirs, and to all the other videos that they've seen have gone viral. When we understand that adults and children can't say no when an officer asks them for sex, we understand that now. But when it comes to searches, the courts call it consent. Am I done? Oh, okay, great, good. I was trying to read and it was a little hard. So we know from the Me Too movement that it's not easy to say no to a person in power. From the perspective of civilians, the constitutional limits that Terry puts on are scary. They're like the victims of Harvey Weinstein. These teenagers have to weigh their options at a bad time, not a time of their own choosing, at a time when they feel vulnerable. You can't fix this by training officers. The power dynamic is just there. So in reality, these rights are virtually impossible to assert in the street. And once we recognize that the consent doctrine is a sham, that it's not safe for vulnerable citizens to say no to an officer, then you have to get rid of Terry versus Ohio, because Terry versus Ohio rests on the idea that people can say no to the police, that people have a right to walk away if the officer doesn't have reasonable suspicion, that even if the officer stops them, that the person doesn't have to answer their questions. It rests on the idea that when the officer wants to search their bag, that they say no. So if you take a look at what happened to Eric Gardner, one way to understand it is he was killed because the police were using Terry versus Ohio to fight crime. They wanted to find out what was in his pockets. The police needed him to cooperate, to consent, and he did not. Thank you.
Hi. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to spend 12 minutes talking about protesting while black and looking at the ways in which the media legitimizes violence against marginalized groups and using as an example blacks and the Ferguson, Missouri saga. My thesis is this, that news using text in every semantic form, words, images, still and moving images, right, and or sound, and through all mediums, broadcast, print, internet, social media, news serves as a basis of our social discourse and allows us to build consensus, if not agreement, over a myriad of social problems, right, and solutions to those problems, such as systemic injustices visited upon vulnerable and marginalized groups. However, the ways in which the media constructs and articulates narratives around individuals and those marginalized groups demonstrably otherizes those bodies and delegitimizes their dissent. As I hope to demonstrate over the next 10 minutes or so, and using the movement once again precipitated by Michael Brown's murder and the subsequent protests and media's account of that, I want to show that through the routine processes of news gathering and construction, media persistently advances a long-standing racial trope regarding black men and criminality and delegitimization of black claims making. And moreover, I hope to assert that, I will assert that the media even sanctions power reified by white law enforcement structures through law and order narratives. I also claim that the media insists upon its own maintenance as well as law enforcement's maintenance of within our social political hierarchy. So, as a preview, just going to give a brief history. Let's talk about the media coverage of Ferguson, talk about comparatively white crime and white grievance, routines of news gathering, and media theory. Daniel Monahan, I should say this, I'm sorry. Blacks have persistently had to wage wars around our vision in popular culture because it seems we're never afforded the privilege of individualization. From Daniel Monahan's infamous report, The Negro Family, the case for a crisis in Black America, to stories of the decline of the African-American family, to the 1986 CBS News special report on the crisis in the black family, the vanishing family. U.S. News and World Report running a story entitled A Shocking Look at Blacks in Crime, and stories on black pathology and crime in Chicago. We've been consistently presented and represented as a problem to be solved, and we have to contend with media perpetuation of constructions of blacks as a problem. And James Baldwin said it very well. In fact, the media depictions of blacks as thugs, criminals, or people otherwise bent on social disruption has a 400-year history in America. Since the first slave ships' arrival to the New World in 1619 marked the beginning of the possession and commodification of black bodies in America, newspapers played a role in slavery's commercialization and in depicting and describing slaves and their activities, and were instrumental in constructing the image of blacks in the popular imagination. And between 1619 and 1775, there were approximately 80 weekly, bi-weekly, or tri-weekly newspapers circulating in and between the colonies. News publications during the colonial era took the form of multi-page newspapers, pamphlets, things they called broadsides and leaflets. And in them, news touching on the Negro was explicit and almost always negative. The proceedings of the rebellious Negroes were weekly reports on slave activities. and it was actually a thing. As formal mass media and news gathering channels were not in abundance, news was often based upon hearsay and gossip. However, news items would also appear as letter extracts, editor reports, execution sermons, or last word confessions from the scaffold. So we can see here examples of press accounts, which also instilled in those colonists fears. For example, the Boston Weekly Postboy was the first to publish a 1741 letter that told of a planned Jamaican slave insurrection to, quote, destroy all the whites, end quote, on the island. And perhaps due to the dire social risk to whites that any slave rebellion symbolized, published accounts in one newspaper outlet were often picked up by other newspapers. For example, the Boston Evening Post printed a letter on a thwarted uprising on April 1st, 1745, which was subsequently reprinted in New York newspapers and ran 12 days in Philadelphia's Pennsylvania Gazette. And it wasn't just about slave uprisings or the fear of slave uprisings that these news narratives took on. Rape was often a feature, a story in these news stories. News narratives of alleged rapes or actual rapes evinced a distinctive racist contrast. Now, when blacks were accused in those newspapers or were found guilty of rape, the defendant was nameless, right? With newspapers recounting, quote, a Negro, end quote, or, quote, a mulatto, end quote, offense against a, quote, white woman, end quote, or a, quote, white child, end quote. In white-on-white rape accounts, however, the race of neither party is mentioned. Moreover, stories of white-on-white rapes, when reported at all, were reported for either their particular viciousness or the victim's vulnerability. Thus, in acts of white-on-white rape, the exnomination, the elimination of whiteness, making it invisible, and the particularization of the crime's heinousness, the news stories were constructed to engender outrage at the individual and the act, but in no way written to infer white men's general depravity, right? In contrast, erasing the story with an undifferentiated, non-specific Negro, readers by inference could assimilate the crime and the criminal into a larger, undifferentiated group, i.e. this black person could be any black. And as news reports would trumpet the dire consequences that befell the unsuccessful rebellions or punishment meted out to black transgressor, the intent perhaps was to reassure whites that blacks had been brought to justice, the absolute guilt of the black defendants was affirmed, and the restabilization of racial hierarchies was assured. Right? How does this come about, fast forward, in terms of news stories? It's important to understand and appreciate crime and protest scripts. We understand what a script is, and a news narrative is a specific type of script that a writer or journalist engages, right? A news narrative has major components of there's an event, there's temporal relationship, contributing or causal relationship, and a unifying theme. I was walking down the street one day, and all of a sudden I tripped and fell. I broke my arm, went to the hospital, but now I'm better. Event, relationship one day, temporal relationship, I tripped, and an ending, right? Crime and protest scripts go by the axiom, if it bleeds, it leads, particularly with regards to television news, right? Crime scripts have the distinctive characteristics of being violent, being episodic, and having a causal agent, something causing the event to occur. News narrative components, once again, has crime scripts and, I should say, narrative components of protest scripts, I should say, have those two components of being a crime script, they follow the crime script, as well as selection and descriptive biases in them. So, for example, with regards to protest scripts hew to the crime news accounts with a focus on concrete episodic events. However, they will often highlight the protesters' outsider or socially marginal status and question the participants' socio-political legitimacy. News stories on demonstrations may also present public opinion polls or evoke bystander opinion about the protests, not the protest issues, right? So the meta-narratives coursing through the protest accounts express disapproval toward protest and dissent and a quote-unquote return to normalcy. Interestingly, and not as much commented on, is this notion of interdependence between the media and the criminal justice system that we encounter. News media rely on criminal and criminal law enforcement agents for their most lucrative content, employing stringers and beat reporters to courthouses and jailhouses on a daily basis. Now, through police reports, rap sheets, arrest photographs, criminal and court records, and press conferences, criminal and law enforcement institutions determine the most basic construction of those news narratives. Now, institutional narratives are further privileged through press conferences, which we often see, especially in instances of police brutality, shootings, and killings by officers. Right? Press conferences and interviews which feature institutional agents whose monologic nature, their dress, demeanor, and setting, along with the one-to-many format of press conferences, endow those institutions, the agents, and their narratives with a credibility and legitimacy that's not necessarily afforded to the victims of those crimes. Right? It's important to know a few things about the disparate treatment of blacks in the media, knowing that there's this interdependence between the criminal justice system and our justice institutions, our law enforcement agencies, and the media, in that it is the primary source of their primary reporting. We know this. In national news television broadcasts, blacks are underrepresented as police or law enforcement officers, are underrepresented as crime victims. Whites, however, are overrepresented as crime victims, and in local news television broadcasts, blacks are grossly overrepresented as crime perpetrators and underrepresented as news readers, reporters, socially positive or benign roles in crime stories, a bystander, an EMT person, a police officer, another police officer. Right? And so we see these differences time and time again. And a lot of it can be attributed to theories of agenda setting and framing that occur within news agencies. Agenda setting is basically through the routine structuring, through the routine structuring of social and political reality. Media tells us what to think about. By its selection of stories and its election to put certain news stories and eliminate other stories as news, it tells us what to think about in terms of the salience of things. Another convention is the act of framing. Framing news stories for audience interpretation is a routine deployed by news content creators as well as everyday citizens who retell or retransmit stories. News stories can be framed by content, by organization, or themes with slants or hooks. Front page, top of the fold, the color of the lettering, the type of lettering, the words chosen, the light and angle of a photograph. All of those things frame the images, frame the stories for us, and aid in telling the story that is desired to be communicated. Just one brief example, here was a front cover of St. Louis Post-Dispatch the night after, or the day after, a particularly violent night and a day of peaceful protest. And you see here what the editors and the writers have elected to do on this front page. Now, they could have chosen a lot of different images out of St. Louis because there were, like I said, peaceful protests that occurred in the light of day. Instead, they chose or elected to show or to present above the fold this image. Note how the red, the color, cites or infers panic and infers action. We have here an anchor about protests, and then we have here an image at the bottom of an African-American man looting a store. Out of all of the images that the editors could have selected to talk about racial injustice, about Michael Brown, about what was going on there, these were the images and the stories and the leads that they elected to use. Framing is most successful when it's invisible. However, in my analysis of the Michael Brown shooting, I wanted to find out what adverse words were being used in those stories. And I looked at roughly about 1,800 stories, radio, broadcast, transcripts, as well as paper stories, right? And here's just some accounts of the use of the word thug in association with Michael Brown or the protesters. All right. What am I doing? Oh, okay, I think I may be going to, I'm going to save the rest. I'm just going to go through this and then save the rest for last if we have time, because I think I'm running long. Sorry. All right. And also, lawlessness, robbing, looting, assaulting, violence, mob, riot. Counting the number of times these particular media outlets use those terms gives you an idea, an indication what angle they were seeking and what they were proposing, or I should say advancing, in terms of the legitimacy of the protests as well as the character of Michael Brown. Some of the pundits and news commentators had these types of things to say about them, about the looting, about people running to the liquor store with bottles of booze, right? Sort of working on and stoking the most offensive stereotypes that you could imagine, right? All right. In contrast, and finally, what you have going on with regards to framing and narratives around white grievance and white violence is very different. So this happened. There was a pumpkin festival somewhere in New Hampshire, and some folks just got upset because the festival ended and decided to have a riot, right? Not a thug amongst them, right? Louisville, Wisconsin game in Lexington, Kentucky. Fires, burning, cars tipped over, drunken revelers, they were described as, but not a thug amongst them, right? Waco shootout, injuries of roughly 177 arrested, 9 dead, out of a gunfight between and amongst rivals of a motorcycle gang. Still not a thug amongst them. And we see this over and over again in terms of who we call terrorists, who we call patriots in the news, versus activists and protesters. And I'll save the rest for last. And I'm going to hand it over to Anthony Farley right now. Thank you.
Slavery is death. Death only, and that continually. The past, says Faulkner, the first part was me, but said William Faulkner, isn't dead, it isn't even past. What we have when we confront a trauma is repetition. We end up trapped like debris around a black hole, right? The accretion disk, for anyone who had to take an astronomy course. The thing is so hot, so heavy that it collapses in upon itself. Like time and space are rendered meaningless in the singularity. Everything plunges into it and plunges into it forever, right? We revolve, but it's a forever revolution. But not the kind that makes things better, the kind that just looks the same to any outside observer. But we're inside. Slavery is death, death only, and that continually. How does this, oh gosh, that's a complicated beginning, isn't it? Not really. I think you'll all feel you knew everything I told you by the end, that you knew what I told you. By the end, you will feel you've always known what I explained. Slavery to segregation to neo-segregation isn't progress. It isn't anything. It's the movement from white over black to white over black to white over black. It's the pretend time in which we exist after that most traumatic moment, slavery. Anyone have any individual traumas? Try slavery. If individuals can have trauma, and slavery would be a trauma for any individual, then collections of people can have collective trauma, and slavery is our trauma, and we have never left that moment. People talk about progress, but the progress they talk about is the progress that occurs in the pretend time. It's pretend progress. We pretend that the movement from slavery to segregation to neo-segregation is some kind of movement, when it's in fact the emotionless kind of movement. Pretend movement, from white over black to white over black to white over black. The trauma obliterates our sense of time. Past, present, future all collapse as with a singularity. It's stranger than we can think, and so we don't. We neurotically repeat the past, trying to reconstruct a better future, well, by looking to the past, by collecting fragments, right? Let's do it again and get it wrong. Let's do it again, we get it wrong. We do it again, we get it wrong. We do it again, we get it wrong. That's where we are now, still talking about the same thing. Nothing survives slavery, right? We think we're making choices, but choices are different from repetitions. Life is about choices, but we don't even know the roots of the things that motivate us in one direction or another, and so we're not really making choices when we think we are. We're just repeating the same white over black of the past, each time with a new institution, but the new institution isn't new because it returns us right to where we were, white over black, again and again and again, world without end. So, gosh, that's a downer. Is it? Are you with me? So the past is not past. It isn't. The past is not dead. It isn't even past. Gosh, but death is a funny thing. Trumpism is death worship. Trumpism is death worship. The thing I think we need to do now, as the haunted dead of that slavery trauma, is to think sociologically about the dead. Think criminologically about the dead. Trumpism is death worship. MAGA means slavery. Roy Moore admitted it. No Trumpster denies it. MAGA means slavery. Slavery is death, death only, and that continually. Everyone knows what it means to put a buffoon in charge of a 21st century industrialized economy. Everyone knows what it means to put a buffoon in charge of USA environmental policy. Everyone knows what it means to put a madman. I don't know if Donald Trump is mad. I do know that sober observers say he's insane. I don't mean it as a joke. I mean this is a real problem. Sober observers say he's insane. So let's just leave that as we don't know. But smart people say he's insane. That should be enough. Well, everyone knows what it means to put a person who might be insane in command of 100,000 Hiroshimas. Everyone knows what that means, and people don't do it unless they have fallen in love with death. It might be a love that they don't acknowledge. It might be a love that they won't cop to. It might be a love that they hate that they have, but you have to love it to have cast your vote in that way on November 8, 2016. Nobody made any mistakes on November 8, 2016. That much we can say. So we're repeating things. Slavery is death, death only, and that continually. We can elect a person who ran on, what did he run on? That's right, overt racism, right, which is always a carry back to slavery. Build a wall. Who went to school here? Who went to school? Who's read books? Did anybody ever tell you that build a wall was an argument? Ban Muslims. Was there ever a moment in school where that didn't sound stupid to the people who were teaching you to not sound stupid? 5 minutes. What was another Trumpism? Oh, grab them by the genitals. He didn't say genitals, did he? What did he say? Oh, well, that would be rape, wouldn't it? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Oh, we don't know the answer to that anymore? This is how it goes. Well, we didn't know during slavery, right? You couldn't rape a slave. The laws of this country deemed that, at most, to be trespass if the slave wasn't your own. But if the slave was yours, then you owned that slave. You owned him or her. And if it was a her, you owned the product of that rape as your property. Look, a new lawnmower, a new garden rake, a new shovel, a new baby slave. So, gosh, okay, I have to go much faster. I was going to do a whole thing on Plessy versus Ferguson. You know about Plessy versus Ferguson, don't you? An 1896 case, separate but equal is fine. You probably don't know about the dissent in which Justice Brown, disagreeing with the principle of separate but equal, said we didn't need separate but equal because we could get it done just following our regular principles of constitutional liberty. The white race, he said, deems itself to be superior in accomplishments, in this and that, and wealth, and so I doubt not it will remain for all time, provided it sticks to its principles of constitutional liberty. So in Plessy versus Ferguson, you've got on the one hand a majority saying, let's uphold separate but equal. On the other hand, you've got a dissent held to be the good guys by everybody. The dissent says it'll be white supremacy forever so long as we hold on to our constitutional principles. So there's something in those constitutional principles that is a quick return to the past. Our legal machinery, our apparatus of rights, returns us back to the past. It's a time machine to make sure that all we do is repeat white over black, white over black, white over black. Wren versus United States, 100 years later in 1896, a case that arises out of D.C. for crying out loud. What happened in Wren versus United States? Oh, two cop guys are out there cruising. What are you cruising for when you're a cop? You're cruising for young black bodies, aren't you? When you're cruising out there in the dark in your cop car, you're looking for black boys behaving badly. And if you don't find black boys behaving badly, as you peer out into the darkness looking for young black bodies behaving badly, for your eyes to alight upon, to jump out, to confront, to handcuff, to caress. Oh, wait, am I describing the Terry stop in a creepy way? Can you Terry stop each other? Do the frisk of the outer clothing to check for weapons within the confines of the law? Not really, unless you get permission or unless you're a cop. So, gosh, what if the police say they stopped you for a traffic violation, but they didn't really, and you can perhaps prove it? Someone help me. You guys aren't all lawyers. What if you can prove, hey, you guys didn't pull me over for that traffic violation. You pulled me over because I'm black. And you've got a weird thing for young black people. Or old black people. Weirder. What happens then? Unconstitutional? No. Wren versus United States is the Supreme Court saying that you can pretextual stops pass constitutional scrutiny. So as long as we could have pulled you over for a legitimate reason, it doesn't matter if the reason why we actually pulled you over was because of your race. So gosh, if I decide I have a thing against red-haired people and I only pull them over, who are all the crooks going to be? Red-haired people. And we'll develop a whole thing about red-haired people, right? They know their tempers. That's why I shot him. He went off. Look at his hair. We got to keep those people off the jury, setting this place on fire. They might even come up with their own culture, right? The roof is on fire. A few people know that, right? So, okay, I was going to do a thing about Hiroshima because I wanted to tie it to that metaphor of the singularity, the sun that collapses into a black hole. Remember Hiroshima? Remember the madman in charge of 100,000 of them that we elected out of death worship? Listen to me from a film called Hiroshima, My Love, Hiroshima, Mon Amour. And if I had more time, I'd have linked the Mon Amour part to the erotics of race pleasure that take place with every confrontation on the street, that have taken place from the very beginning, because that's what it is to own a body. When you own someone's body, you can do whatever you want with it. It is yours. You learn to see it, right? You learn to value it. You learn that it's a place where your id can just go freely walking, unconstrained by superego. Are you guys following me on this? It's like dreaming when you're awake, right? You can dream with other people's bodies. They don't matter. I can do what I want with them. And when I wake up, when I walk back from the slave quarters, I'm good again. That dream didn't mean anything. You ever have a dream where you wake up and you think, oh, that was odd. Let me tell no one. Well, the slave quarters are like that. So is cruising in your cop car for young black boys. That's also like that. And that's a hard thing to give up, and no one gives it up. Listen to me from the film Hiroshima Mon Amour, Alan Resnais' reflection on the Hiroshima bomb in 1959. Listen to me, I know something else. I know it will begin all over again. 200,000 dead, 80,000 wounded in 9 seconds. These figures are official. It will begin all over again. It will be 10,000 degrees on Earth, 10,000 suns, they will say. The asphalt will burn, chaos will prevail, a whole city will be raised from the earth and fall back in ashes. It will begin all over again. Everyone knows what it means to put a madman in charge of 100,000 Hiroshimas. And yet, I can't really end there because the force of history tells me, oh gosh, I'm actually getting a slave spiritual. It's somehow communicated to me. God gave Noah the rainbow sign, no more fire of the water next time. So we're here waiting for the mile-high wave that comes when racism gives you such a high that you turn over U.S. environmental policy to a buffoon just as you are reaching that red line zone, right? That red line, remember the environmental red line? So we're just here waiting for the mile-high wave, like the deluge that we welcomed. Who are these people that vote for Trump? They hate us. They hate the future. They hate childhood. They hate children. They've got thousands of them locked up in cages now. They hate life itself, right? They're sick of it. And they'll end it. And slavery is death, death only, and that continually. Progress hasn't been made. We haven't confronted this. How am I doing with time? Am I at 0 or at 1? Am I really wrapping up at 1, or am I over and you're just saying that to be kind? Okay, good. I wanted to make sure. It will begin all over again. Our sense of time was shattered at the beginning as an invisible man. The end was the beginning. We are like those Hiroshima shadows. Uh-oh, failed metaphor. Because for you guys, the apocalypse is viral, right? But for old people like me, it's nuclear. Who knows what a Hiroshima shadow is? Here are the children playing with a ball. Uh-oh, the 0 hour of American racism and arrogance has vaporized those children, leaving a paint shadow on the wall. That's us, right? Just repeating. The ball never drops. The thing is, when it comes to trauma, individual or collective, there's a time that we are in. I might call it I have called it spectacular time. But within this weird time bubble, there's another time that keeps ticking, which is historical time. That's when you have to stop the carbon emissions, or you get the mile-high wave that drowns everyone. And that's the wave that people are welcoming. Like, that's the drowning that our original sin, the Middle Passage, has now brought us all to, right here at end stage, right? End stage American racism. Thank you.
Social media, policing, stop and frisk.
Or did you all agree with everything I said? That would be fantastic in the first time.
I want to ask a question that you know and you can answer. Is police or are police friends of society?
Are police what?
Friends of society.
Friend of society.
Friends of the society?
Yes.
Can you explain what you mean by friends of the
That
society?
is why I said it. See,
It's a trick question.
why I have said this, I don't like pretense. I like to be realistic in my approach of life. Police, they are part of criminal justice system, and they are law enforcement agency. At a particular time in life, you will see them hiding under one cover and the other of the government after they might have committed crimes themselves. We have had lectures on shooting, either knowingly or accidental discharge, either intentional or unintentional. Taking life from people is highly prohibited by the law, except the government executes the, criminal. Then, how do we really judge it? The way and the right manner and the trends of killings by the police in society.
I mean, what you're bringing up, I think, is that when we think about what's wrong with policing and we think about what's wrong with what happened to Eric Gardner, we have a tendency to see police killings as being separate and apart from the institution of policing. We ask, maybe there's one bad officer we should be prosecuting, et cetera. But when they crunch the numbers, and we also have been looking a lot in terms of race at who gets killed and who doesn't. But when you look at the numbers and crunch them, it's whoever comes into contact with police are most likely to end up getting hurt. So if you think about stop and frisk as being the funnel along with the way car stops are, right? So you have driving while black issues that can turn violent. We know that from a young man, or an older man actually, running from the police and getting shot and killed in the back. That case in South Carolina, North Carolina, one of the Carolinas. And so we are aware that traffic stops can lead to this, and stop and frisk can lead to this as well. So this is to do with, we've created a criminal justice system which give police a lot of discretion about who they're going to stop. And you spoke to that a lot, about the idea that they have so much power. I think that's one of the things you're talking about, to choose who they want to stop and who they want to investigate. And the people, and so the racial makeup of who gets stopped in cars and on the street ends up being very, very similar to who gets killed by the police. It's the same racial profile. So I don't know if that is partly answering your question. So I like to think of stop and frisk as a funnel. There's one question, and do you want to answer that too?
No, they're not your friend. If they were your friends, they would study peace studies. That would be a major that they would do. They would have a graduate degree in peace studies, and they would not be armed. So the fact that we have armed police patrolling shows something is amiss with our fundamental approach to the system.
Is there a question earlier than me?
Oh, I don't know.
America. He's going to identify sort of the central issue of some of the things we see nowadays as being a deep conflict within what it means to police. That there's a conflict between what it means to protect and what it means to investigate. And that the police have always been charged with doing both. Not only protecting in advance of the crime, but investigating after. That the inherent conflict in terms of what their actual job entails leads them to do exactly what you're talking about. You just used the word, to investigate before there's actually been a crime. Right? And so that leads to a logic and a principle that allows in their minds them to justify behavior that's clearly not particularly justifiable.
I'm going to say something else. Don't think for a moment that any of us, that anyone around us is worried for one single solitary second about crime as a social policy matter. Our approach to crime is to manufacture recidivism. So there's something about crime that we like. I'll posit this, that the something about crime that we like is we like it when we produce it in the black, brown, and poor bodies where we like to hunt it down. If we had a problem with crime, we would look like Iceland, or Sweden, or Finland, or Norway, or Denmark. And I don't mean white. What I mean by looking like those countries is looking like the kind of country that, say, African American votes would make us into, right? We vote left, we vote in that direction. So we don't do that because we actually like manufacturing crime and implanting it in black and brown and poor bodies. Crime makes it look like they deserve it. Crime makes us feel better than them. Crime is a great way to justify the enslavement and economic disarrangement of the groups that we want to see behaving in anomalous ways. So,
Terrific example. Stash house cases.
yes. Oh, I should say, I was a prosecutor here in D.C. for 3 years and 2 weeks. I was an assistant United States attorney with the U.S. Attorney's Office for 3 years and 2 weeks, 1989 to 1992.
And I should say for stop, just to back up that idea, stop and frisk, over those 4.4 million stops in New York that they tracked for that decade, the number one crime that they uncovered, possession of marijuana. That was the number one crime. So, and when they tested to see if crime, talking about violent crime, went up after stop and frisk ended, it did not. So it really is a way of controlling bodies.
Drug use and distribution behaviors don't vary across race. Enforcement does. In the typical, forgetting the percentage, but I think it's well over 90% of drug possession cases, the drugs possessed are actually, it's such a minuscule amount that it's all used up in testing. So what the prosecutor waves around in the courtroom is an empty plastic bag with another empty plastic bag with a certificate in it saying the stuff that used to be in here, the junk, was tested and found to be junk, but, take our word for it because it's all gone.
Did you go through an evolution when you went into the U.S. Attorney's Office and the man you came out to be, or were you?
I would like to say that I was like Saul of Tarsus, and I went in, and the scales fell from my eyes. That would be the cool narrative, but I don't have that narrative. I was just a deeply cynical person who thought, well, this will do me some good if I do the state some service, and put it on my resume, and I'll just not do the really evil stuff, and I'll escape morally unscathed. That turned out not to be true either.
Hi, excuse me. Well, I thought of a few things. My name is Jerica, and during the presentation, a few things just formed thoughts in my mind. During the initial presentation, my notes formed a question about just consensual encounters and defining consent in the society, and that it was connected to a Me Too movement, which is a recent social protest. I don't see the media, or when I do attend events, I don't see much context around discussing society norms and what sort of manners are good and what to do away with. I don't see that discussion. So when I am here and it is presented to me that there is a law defining what is consent and what is refusal to this Terry doctrine, then it forms a question for me. So if you have anything to add to that, any small morsels of knowledge.
And I also think you might, she's asking also to do that social media, so if you want to.
Yeah, you go.
Well, I wrote an article where I was comparing the concept of consent within Fourth Amendment, because that's the Constitution that controls the issue of when police say, may I search your car, may I search your body, may I search your bag. It's the Fourth Amendment, consent to consent in rape doctrine. And when you look at the way feminists have critiqued rape, it was very, very similar. Basically, what we think of as the bad old days of the law on rape, women had to fight their accuser. If they didn't fight back physically, then they were seen as cooperating, and it was essentially consensual. And we have the same thing here within the Fourth Amendment, is that you have to show your disapproval to the point where you actually might be in danger. And we know that it is dangerous to walk away from police. Even though the law says you have an absolute right to walk away, we see that you can actually do the numbers. Who gets shot are people who run from police. Walking away is a dangerous thing. We know that from some of the things we've seen go viral. And we also know it from my students who tell me we can't teach the law to kids because we would be endangering these teenagers that we're teaching know your rights. We'd be putting them in danger if we told them that the law says you can walk away. So that tells you right there that this is a fiction, essentially, created by the court.
Even running from the police has to be examined. Who's run from the police? I have, enshrouded by my white friends in my white suburb. You ever go swimming in somebody else's pool at night as a teenager? Is that not a thing here?
Legally.
No, without their permission. This was called pool jumping. This is called pool jumping in white America. Some people aren't letting everybody know about it. It's called pool jumping. As a teenager, you go out, you go drinking, you swim in somebody's pool, the glass bottle always breaks, they come out thinking it's a burglary. You damn kids, the police are called, and you show off how great it is to be 16 years old. Look how my body glides over the fence. Look at you weighted down by your mortgage and your lack of exercise. You can't catch me, and you mock the police for chasing you, and you do it again in another pool. That's what you do. Because that kind of law, shoot them in the head, Tennessee versus Garner, doesn't apply in white American land. It applies to black people. Right, those are the ones. There's a special kind of pleasure in going after black bodies. In my very first law review article, The Black Body as Fetish Object, I talked about race pleasure that motivates jurisprudence and also government, citizen, and citizen-to-citizen interactions. We don't talk about that, our racial orientation, the way it feels good and normal and great to large parts of our citizenry to do bad things to black people.
Yes.
I want to add two things to that. You had a second question.
Will you stand up?
I do have two more because there are three parts to the
Mind sit
presentation.
down. Roxanne, you want me to?
Yeah, stand up. Otherwise, we're the only ones standing.
Two things, and it goes back to what you just said, Anthony, and the Cotton Knowledge, that novel, that book, about running and about black men. One of the things that also needs to be interrogated about our justice system is the role that police officers play in a whole host of things, and not only investigations, but in apprehension for wrongs that are totally unrelated to crime or criminalization. Walter Scott ran from that cop who shot him in the back because he thought he had some outstanding warrants because of some non-payment of child support. He knew that when that cop ran his license plate, a warrant was going to pop up that he was wanted, that he had unpaid child support payments. So he ran, and thus he wrote his own death sentence there. That type of issue needs to be really examined in terms of the roles that we give cops in our society. And the second part has to do with...
You add that he was old and out of shape, and he ran at 1 mile an hour.
Yeah, ran at 1 mile an hour. Yeah.
So it's running, quote unquote, but it's moving while walking.
Yeah, right. Moving while. And finally, just secondly, and this goes once again to Anthony's point about the fetishization of black bodies and black men. Frighteningly, tragically, we hear it with Darren Wilson, with regards to Michael Brown. We hear with James Van Dyke, who was just convicted for shooting Laquan McDonald 16 times. How do they describe these men? Darren Wilson, he looked like a demon. He looked like a demon. James Van Dyke, his eyes were bugging out. They were totally white, and he was coming at me.
These are
Tamir Rice was big for his age, prosecutors said. There's this pathology. Claudia Rankine says it. Because white men can't police their imaginations, black men are not. Right? There's this pathology that goes on in these moments and in these exchanges and interactions that are just downright frightening and chilling. And I think that's something that we can't ignore.